The wreck of HMS Birkenhead off South Africa in February 1852 is where the legend, women and children first, took on flesh and bone. They called it the Birkenhead drill, but it wasn't a drill at all, it was a choice, made in darkness and rising sea, on a ship torn open by rock that sent every woman and child to safety and kept hundreds of soldiers standing still as the deck slipped from under their boots. This is the story of HMS Birkenhead. The night chivalry at sea was born. Every woman and child survived, only a few men did. HMS Birkenhead began as a promise of industrial progress. Built of iron, still a radical choice for a warship in the mid-19th century, she was laid down by John Laird's yard at Birkenhead and launched in late 1845. She started life as HMS Vulcan, named for the Roman god of the forge, before quickly taking the town's name for her own. 2 steam engines, each rated at roughly 564 horsepower, drove tall paddle wheels. 2 masts, initially brig-rigged, could still carry sail. She was one of the Royal Navy's early experiments with iron hulls and steam power, faster and more comfortable than the old wooden troop carriers, but also a new kind of question mark. How would iron behave under cannon fire? What would a jagged breach look like, and could it be plugged? The Admiralty, wary of iron in combat and moving towards screw propellers rather than paddles, decided to convert her from steam frigate to troopship before she was ever commissioned for fighting. Inside, Birkenhead reflected the new engineering optimism. She was divided into multiple watertight compartments, 8 transverse sections with the engine room subdivided longitudinally, an early nod toward damage control. Her bow carried a figurehead of Vulcan, hammer raised, and her stern was rounded in the newest style. On paper, she could make about 10 knots under steam as a troopship, quick work in an age when many transports still depended on fickle wind. In service, she proved herself useful in routine duties and even lent a hand in maritime emergencies, but her defining voyage was still ahead. By the early 1850s, Britain's imperial wars kept the troop lanes busy. The 8th Cape Frontier War, fighting between British colonial forces and the Xhosa in southern Africa, needed reinforcements. As winter settled on Britain, Birkenhead prepared to carry men, a handful of officers' families, and a small cavalry draft to the Cape. She was unglamorous, practical, and, because iron and steam were still new, quietly modern. No one boarding her in Portsmouth imagined her name would pass into proverbial speech. In January 1852, under Captain Robert Salmond, Royal Navy, HMS Birkenhead sailed from Portsmouth carrying detachments from multiple regiments, men in their teens and 20s, many new to the army, many bound for their first taste of campaigning. She put in at Queenstown, today's Cove, for additional troops and, as transports often did, embarked several officers' wives and children. The passage to the Cape was uneventful. On the 23rd of February, she reached Simonstown, Simon's Bay, near Cape Town, a naval station on the lip of False Bay. Most of the women and children disembarked briefly there, then re-embarked for the final leg along the coast to Algoa Bay. 9 cavalry horses came aboard, hay was stowed and coal was topped up. At 6 p.m. on 25 February, Birkenhead steamed out again, hugging the coast to save time. Close inshore, you could sometimes find a countercurrent that sharpened a captain's schedule, useful when you wanted to make a morning landfall. By midnight, the sea was calm, the sky clear, the ship holding a steady 8 to 8.5 knots on her paddles. A leadsman, the sailor heaving a weighted line over the side to sound the depth, called out 12 fathoms, about 22 metres, near 2 a.m. Before the next cast, the hull shuddered and lifted. An unseen tooth of rock had bitten into the Birkenhead just forward. The point, an uncharted spur near Danger Point, east of Cape Town, sat only a few miles off the coast, sometimes visible in rough weather, hidden under a skin of calm in the dark. The bow had 2 fathoms beneath it, the stern 11. Captain Salmond rushed to the deck, ordered the anchor let go, quarter boats lowered, and engines reversed to back her off. For a moment the ship freed herself, then slammed down again on the reef. Iron plates buckled and rivets tore. A mouth opened under the forward bilge. Water rushed in, unanswerable and cold. In the forward berths, more than 100 soldiers drowned almost where they slept. The new idea of watertight compartmentalization might have saved her, had the wrong rip not ripped through too many spaces at once. Sailors call the backmost deck the poop, a raised afterdeck. The captain had men massed there to lighten the bow while orders rattled off in that clipped, deliberate tone every sailor and soldier recognises. Calm words carrying the panic you refuse to show. The chain pumps, crank devices meant to move water up and out, were manned by 60 soldiers. 60 more were set to work at the boat tackles, the blocks and winches that lower boats into the water. The rest stood to under their officers. Below, the engine room flooded, the paddles churned in reverse, useless now. Above, the boats were the only hope. But boats are like parachutes, brilliant when they open, deadly if they foul. One large boat swamped immediately. Another couldn't be launched at all. Its winches were stuck fast by paint and neglect. That left only 3. Smaller boats truly workable, far too few for the hundreds still aboard. The women and children were brought into the cutter alongside. Then the choices started narrowing to 1. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Seaton, commanding the 74th Highlanders aboard, had fought before. He could read a sea as well as a battlefield. He understood, as any officer does, that a panicked rush at the boats would swamp them. The first to drown would be the very people the boats were meant to save. Captain Salmond is said to have called at the last those who can swim, jump and make for the boats. Seaton, reading the geometry of Harlem water, cut across with an order that has echoed ever since. Stand fast. It is a short phrase. On that deck it meant everything. It meant, do not move, do not try to save yourself if the act might kill those in the boats, do not break formation, keep your ranks. It meant, hold the line. We can picture, because survivors described it, the soundscape of the next minutes, the kick and whinny of frightened horses below, the steady bark of orders, the rasp of blocks and tackles, the hush that sometimes falls on a crowd when panic loses its voice. The soldiers, many barely trained, formed up and held their ground. The Birkenhead drill was not a written procedure. It was discipline poured into action. To stand and be still to the Birkenhead drill is a damn tough bullet to chew, Rudyard Kipling would write 4 decades later, honouring that exact kind of courage, the kind that looks like quiet. Within 20 minutes of the first strike, the ship broke her back. The funnel fell. The forepart, everything forward of the mainmast, went down almost at once. The stern, crowded thick with men, lifted and hung for a handful of minutes, then slid under. Some of the cavalry mounts were driven overboard, urged to swim. A few, astonishingly, made it ashore and were found later, quivering on the dunes. The men who could swim tried for the coast, a jagged line 2 miles away. Some clung to wreckage as the current pulled at them. Some struck out through the chop alone. Many never got the chance. Great white sharks hunt those waters. Locals would later nickname them Tommy Sharks, after the British soldiers' Tommies they were said to have taken. Survivors reported seeing men vanish with a cry. Others were beaten back by surf on the rocks. Enough made it to the beach to tell the story, bare-chested, bleeding, eyes full of the last things they'd seen. And yet, when the roll of the living was taken, one detail stood bolt upright against the chaos. Every woman and every child aboard who embarked in the boats survived. Contemporary accounts and later histories converge on roughly 26 women and children in all. Some say 7 women and 13 children on the final leg from Simon's Bay. Others count a few more who had remained aboard to continue east. But the point is unambiguous. They all lived. Of about 638 to 643 people aboard, only 193 survived. Numbers in disaster often blur. This pair of facts has not. The women and children were saved. The majority of the men were not. Morning brought wind and a scatter of debris. A schooner, the Lioness, came upon the lifeboats, took aboard those already rescued, then made for the wreck site and recovered others still clinging to spars and a tangle of rigging that stood like a broken finger out of the sea. Along the coast, exhausted swimmers were hauled out by local people. Others stumbled ashore on their own and collapsed among the scrub. Grief collected in knots, a soldier grimly pulling his mate's kit from the surf, a child found and wrapped in a blanket, a boot on the tide line with nobody in it. By afternoon, the schooner had done what could be done. Everything else was wreckage, of the ship, of families, of easy narratives about war and travel and safety. Victorian Britain, hungry for exemplars, found one here. Reports of the wreck moved quickly through newspapers and official channels, and the tale crystallised around a simple ethic. In extremis, the strong restrained themselves for the vulnerable. Frederick William IV of Prussia ordered the account read to every regiment in his army, not because he owed Britain anything, but because soldierly discipline had shown its highest use, to save others at cost to self. The Royal Navy, meanwhile, took its lumps on maintenance and seamanship, the painted solid winches, the decision to steam close inshore at night, and later administrations improved coastal warnings. On January 1st, 1895, the lighthouse at Danger Point sent its first beam over those reefs, a belated answer to a question asked too late in 1852. If you visit the light today, you'll see a plaque for the Birkenhead set into the masonry, the sea at its feet. The phrase, "women and children first," had been used before in other emergencies, but it was the Birkenhead that made it a touchstone. Not a law, no statute compels it, then or now, but a custom that lodged deep in public imagination. Decades later, on a cold April night in the North Atlantic, people would invoke it again as Titanic's boats touched the water. Kipling's poem Soldier and Sailor Too fixed the Birkenhead drill in literature, and memoirs by survivors anchored it in lived experience. Over time, historians have inspected the legend with the necessary care, noting that crowd behaviour in disasters is complicated and that leadership often shapes the difference between order and stampede. In the Birkenhead's case, leadership was explicit and obedience was total. The line held so the boats could clear. That is why this story endures. If you let the story breathe, you also hold room for smaller details. A gold watch a young cavalry cornet carried as he swam nearly 3 miles to shore. The sight of his own horse waiting on the beach, the way locals renamed the sharks, the quiet that fell among ranks as they waited, knuckles white on the musket stocks they did not need. The National Army Museum in London keeps artefacts from the wreck, and with them a sentence worth repeating. There were only 193 survivors out of 638 passengers and crew, but all the women and children were saved. The Birkenhead also left fingerprints on maritime safety beyond custom. Collisions and groundings drove home the need for reliable charts and better coastal lights along the South African coast. The Danger Point Lighthouse, an octagonal tower 18 metres high, was both memorial and preventive measure, throwing 3 flashes every 40 seconds to warn ships off the same teeth that tore Birkenhead. Wreck charts added Birkenhead rock to their cautions. Sailing directions sharpened advice about hugging that part of the coast at night. While the Victorian age could be sentimental, it was also practical. Mourn, then mitigate. Militarily, the story resonated in barracks and on parade grounds. Commanders used it to talk about discipline as a gift you give in advance to your future self and to strangers you do not yet know. When drilled into tired men on rainy squares, commands can sound mindless. On a failing deck, they can become sacrament. Seaton's "stand fast" was not magic. It was training, trust, and clarity of purpose applied at the exact second when confusion would have killed. In that sense, Birkenhead is less a tale of gallantry as theatre and more a case study in leadership under pressure, a decision tree pruned to one branch taken without flinching. In popular memory, women and children first can slide into stereotype or be held up for debate about gender, duty, and who owes what to whom when minutes count. Social scientists note that most disasters don't unfold like parables. Behaviours vary widely, and self-preservation is powerful. Yet the Birkenhead shows how a small group under explicit orders can change an outcome for the vulnerable, and how that choice can echo far beyond the beach, where the survivors warmed under blankets and looked back at an empty horizon. Even critics of romanticised narratives tend to grant this much. If you are going to have myths, have ones that point you toward generosity rather than away from it. If you write it as a sea story, you end with a marker on a chart and the note a pilot would make: keep well offing. If you write it as a human story, you end with an image: ranks of soldiers still as statues, while a boat beneath them fills with children who will live long enough to say, "My father was there," and wives who will never doubt what their husbands chose. If you write it as an ethic, you end with a sentence: when choices are cruel and resources small, the strong can make space for those who need it most, and sometimes that is enough to change the ending for someone else. HMS Birkenhead did not die quietly, but she died with a purpose. The reef at Danger Point has teeth. Iron and steam could not blunt them. Discipline did something harder. It bent the arc of a disaster toward mercy. That is why the name survives, on a lighthouse plaque, in Kipling's lines, in the simple phrase people still know by heart. Where chivalry at sea was born was not in a book or a law, but on a slanting deck before dawn, when men stood fast so others could go,